Many of you are perhaps somewhat familiar, I hope, with the conventional Indo-European concepts of the underworld. Think of these sort of communal regions of the dead where you may be ferried across a river or, I don't know, retrieved by the Valkyries on the field of battle or something. But what's interesting is that these may have been later traditions that were born out of an earlier understanding of death. One that was more hyperlocal and I would say even fixated on the grave as a place of literal dwelling. This is at least what the French historian Coulanges argues in his book titled The Ancient City, a seminal piece of work, really, which I will go over now. It is important to keep in mind that, as we discuss this, that the early Indo-European religion was very much a domestic one. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, their rituals and their customs were chiefly performed around the home, and not so much out in public, as you may think. And many ancient religions, it's true, behaved this way very similarly. That's not something I'm trying to argue against, but Coulanges does take this a step further, I would say, because he labels it a religion of the dead. So to open this up, the early Indo-Europeans didn't seem to think that the soul went to a different world following death. It seems, to me at least, that they were more convinced that it remained with the body and continued to live in the grave in what is called the second existence. And this seems especially evident in the early Greek and Roman sources when they discuss something called the rites of sepulture. Coulanges writes, "The rites of sepulture show clearly that when a body was buried, those ancient peoples believed they buried something that was living. Virgil, who always describes religious ceremonies with so much care and precision, concludes the account of the funeral of Apollodorus in these words: 'We enclose the soul in the grave.' The same expression is found in Ovid and in Pliny the Younger. This did not correspond to the ideas which these writers had of the soul, but from time immemorial it had been perpetuated in the language, attesting an ancient and common belief." Alright, so a couple of things to note here. This belief of the Greeks and the Romans was principally outdated by the time of Virgil. That much is true. We know that. But the customs that perpetuated the belief were still being practiced in his society. It's kind of like a fossilized tradition of sorts. And you might be thinking this is weird. That's fine. But we have plenty of modern day examples of this. Let's take Halloween, for example, where people dress up in the West because that's what we've practiced for many centuries, But this tradition of dressing up, whether you realize it or not, once served an actual purpose to us. Hallows Eve was said to be the one day of the year where spirits could re-enter our world, so people would wear masks or animal skins or whatever in the hopes that the spirits wouldn't recognize them as a human. So fundamentally, the fossilized customs act as evidence that there was once a purpose to the customs, if that makes sense. And there were other expressions as well that were commonly used in these old Roman ceremonies, like, "May the earth rest lightly upon thee," which to me indicates not only that the person would continue to live in this tomb underground, but that he would still preserve a sense of enjoyment and suffering as well, on top of that. "May the earth rest lightly upon thee." But you have to really get it through your head that these expressions once held power. They actually had meaning. Like, let's take the term rest in peace. Here's an example I could give you that we all know today, but it's been around since the early days of the church. And the Latin expression originally alluded to the doctrine of resurrection. It effectively said, may your body remain undisturbed in this tomb until your soul reunited with it. These expressions, we say them going through the motions, but they once had authority over people, and the inception of them actually had a purpose. Anyways, these early Indo-Europeans believed so firmly that a man lived in his grave beyond death that they often buried him with objects they supposed that he would need in the grave, like various clothing, utensils, weapons, carts. They even slaughtered horses and slaves, with the idea that these beings would serve him in the tomb as they had done during his life. I mean, there's a mountain of archaeological examples that affirm this practice, dating back to the Neolithic. Like, there was a paper a few days ago published by Anthony et al. That says that the Yamnaya were literally burying horses with their dead. This is a very, very old practice. This is roughly 4,500 years ago. And We also see this in a good deal of the daughter cultures of the Indo-Europeans, like the Celts and the Scythians. They all practice this form of grave goods burial. And it's not just an archaeologically specific phenomenon. There's also evidence in early literature, like after the taking of Troy, the Achaeans were said to sacrifice King Priam's daughter Polyxena on the tomb of Achilles, considering she was his captive and was therefore set to be with him for eternity. And so, from this primitive belief came the necessity of burial. In order that the soul might be confined to the subterranean abode, it was necessary that the body to which it remained attached should be covered with earth. So basically, the soul that had no tomb had no dwelling place. And it became a wandering spirit as a result. And in fact, in many Indo-European traditions, this wandering spirit became malevolent, and it would start to do things like torment the living by bringing diseases or affecting the harvest, and sometimes just as simple as appearing in apparitions, as we've seen with the Caligula story. And Coulanges directly states that this is where the belief in ghosts originated from. But the good news is you could rectify this just by simply giving the soul its due rights. All antiquity was persuaded that without burial, the soul was miserable, and that by burial, it became forever happy. It was not to display their grief that they performed the funeral ceremony, it was for the rest and happiness of the dead. The funeral of these early Indo-European people was a process, and so placing the body in the ground was not enough to them. It seems that certain traditional rites had to be observed, and certain established formulas had to be pronounced. And a famous example of what happens when these things are not done properly could be the story of Caligula, where after his death, his body was said to be placed in the earth, without observation of the funeral ceremonies. And as a result, he continued to appear to the living until he was given a proper burial by the people. So even as late as the Roman Empire, these beliefs, whether genuine or born out of superstition, were still being circulated among the populace, at least. And because of these stories and beliefs, men over time began to fear death less than the privation of burial, and punishments by certain tribes and cities began to use this to their advantage. So like a notable example could be the Athenians, who would put generals to death that had neglected to bury the dead following a victory on the field of battle. And so conversely, but kind of within the same vein, many cities would also condemn those guilty of great crimes with the privation of burial. And in this manner, they punished the soul itself with eternal unhappiness, doomed to wander the earth forever. And I would argue this is evident in the Iliad because figures like Achilles, Diomedes, and Odysseus were very concerned about performing the rites for the dead after battle. There's the famous scene, of course, where King Priam visits Achilles in his tent and implores him to allow Hector, his son, a proper burial. And Achilles concedes, which puts the entire war on pause for a time. That's how important these rites were. They literally suspended wars. Another factor to the system of death that we must consider is that the buried individual was not free from human necessities. They still required food and drink, and on certain days of the year, a meal from the family would be carried to every tomb. I mean, so many classical writers describe this process, and some with pretty significant detail, but generally they say that the graves would be surrounded with large wreaths of grasses and flowers, and food and drink offerings were placed upon the tomb itself. There's a quote from Iphigenia in Euripides that says, "I pour upon the earth of the tomb milk, honey, and wine, for it is with these that we rejoice the dead." And the Romans even took this concept just a little bit further. Their tombs would often sponsor something called a culina, which was like a kind of kitchen specifically for the use of the dead. I mean, at some point, we just have to stare into the abyss and ask ourselves, did these traditions begin out of respect for the ancestors, or did they begin with a purpose, and then later down the line, they kind of fossilized into this respectful ritual that it became? To me, the latter is more probable and reasonable, but of course, you guys make your own call. But Coulanges says, these are very old forms of belief and are quite groundless and ridiculous, and yet they exercised empire over man during a great number of generations. They governed men's minds. We shall soon see that they governed societies even, and that the greater part of the domestic and social institutions of the ancients was derived from this source. These customs that I've discussed eventually gave rise to a certain rules of conduct. Since the dead had need of subsistence, it became the duty of the living to satisfy this need, and thus a complete religion of the dead was established early on, whose rites endured until the triumph of Christianity. The dead were thought to be sacred beings, basically. This is attested by a myriad of ancient sources, like Sophocles, Plutarch, Aeschylus, and the Romans even gave the dead the name of manes. Render to the manes what is due to them, says Cicero. They are men who have quitted this life. Consider them as divine beings. And so the tombs acted as the temples of these divinities, and within these temples there was an altar for sacrifice, just as there was in the temples of the gods. This worship of the dead is especially clear among the Hellenes, the Latins, the Sabines, the Etruscans, and even the Aryas of India. That's right, it's laid out in the hymns of the Rig Veda and is spoken of in the laws of Manu as the most ancient worship among men. I mean, even today, the Hindus supply the manas with a form of repast called Shraddha in Sanskrit, which is a yearly ritual designed to pay homage to their ancestors. As Coulanges puts it, this belief and these rites are the oldest and most persistent of anything pertaining to the Indo-European race. This worship was the same in India as in Greece and Italy. Now, if the funeral repast ceased to be offered to the dead in these traditions, the dead would quite literally leave their tombs and become wandering shades, and then they would begin to reproach the living and, would punish them through or by afflicting diseases or perhaps cursing the soil. And this would continue until the funeral feasts were reestablished, I should say. The sacrifice, the offering of nourishment, and the libation restored them to the tomb where they remained. But if the manas were honored through ritual, conversely, then they were seen as tutelary deities, meaning they would protect the family in their affairs, and they would continuously pray for its protection, because they sort of served as middlemen to these upper pantheon of deities. So there was a heavy incentive to upkeep this sort of relationship with your ancestors, and since it was your ancestors that you had to appease, you can see how local the early religion was at one point. So, to return to concepts of the underworld, a sort of communal region of the dead, if you will, this idea may have come later in Indo-European traditions, being that the rites of burial and the worship of the dead, both concepts that we've explored today, evidently disagree with this belief. I might even say inherently, but I don't know if I want to go that far yet. So I tend to side with Coulanges here. It seems like the early religion may have been more hyperlocal, or domestic, as he puts it, centered around the hearth and the grave, and then perhaps transitioned over time to include more universal concepts. So I'm going to leave you all with this absolute heater from Coulanges. He says, "Before men had any notion of Indra or Zeus, they adored the dead. They feared them and addressed them prayers. It seems that the religious sentiment commenced in this way. Death was the first mystery, and it placed man on the track of other mysteries. It raised his thoughts from the visible to the invisible, from the transitory to the eternal, from the human to the divine."